When Sir Jim Ratcliffe and INEOS arrived at Manchester United, this was supposed to be the moment that everything changed. New ownership, new football leadership, and a clean break from years of drift. But nearly 2 years in, United still feel as complicated as ever. There are some signs of structure. There does seem to be some ambition, especially off the pitch, but there's also controversy from comments that we've seen this week. There's confusion, and there seems to be growing questions about leadership, priorities, and timing. Now, for the sake of this video, I'm not going to get into my personal judgment on what Jim Ratcliffe said this week. We've already shared our opinions on that across the channel on multiple videos if you want to check those out. Instead, I want to focus on the bigger picture. Because the problem is, regardless of how you feel about his specific comments, they do represent some of the most controversial remarks made by a sitting Manchester United owner in my lifetime. And when the owner says something that provokes that level of reaction, it inevitably raises a bigger question. Are Jim Ratcliffe and INEOS the right people to run Manchester United? So today, we're going to look at a couple of things. What is INEOS's current plan at Manchester United? And is that plan actually working? So who are INEOS really? To understand their approach, you have to understand their background a little bit. INEOS were founded in 1998 and they've grown into a global industrial giant. They operate in 27 countries, 154 sites worldwide, and generate over £40 billion annually. They also employ more than 24,500 people. And they're not new to sport either. This is the other thing. They're involved in football, Formula 1, cycling, sailing. They operate with pretty much the same mindset everywhere. They're obsessed with efficiency. They're obsessed with control and ruthless decision making. Jim Ratcliffe himself was worth an estimated £17 billion in 2025, even after losing £6 billion year on year. He's still the UK's 7th richest person. This isn't a sort of romantic football club owner. He is an absolutely ruthless corporate operator. So moving on to Manchester United then, what do INEOS actually control? In 2024, INEOS bought a 25% stake in Manchester United for just over £1 billion. But the key detail in all of this is that they took over football operations. Since then, they've moved very, very quickly. They've cut costs across the club by sacking and making many, many hundreds of people redundant. They've also got rid of things like free staff meals, trips to Wembley for staff as well, and a lot of other cutbacks behind the scenes. And all of this is in a push to reduce what Jim Ratcliffe saw as sort of bloated inefficiency. Financially, United posted record revenues of £666.5 million, yet still recorded a £33 million loss. The message from INEOS was very, very clear. The club does make money, but it doesn't run well. Something I think fundamentally we all understood after years of Glazer abuse. Manchester United were not running efficiently. Ratcliffe's whole message was that he was going to fix that, even if it made him unpopular. And to a certain extent, it did make him unpopular. Moving on to the pitch then, has anything improved there? And this is where things start getting even more uncomfortable. United finished 15th last season, the worst league position in decades. Results have improved under Michael Carrick, obviously, but let's be honest, it doesn't feel settled, does it? This isn't a club that seems to be following a singular vision. Who is setting that football vision? That's another question, because right now the structure looks a little bit unusual at Manchester United. So let's move on to that structure then, because it is a sort of flat structure by design. After sporting director Dan Ashworth was sacked in December 2024, as I'm sure we all remember, Man United made a pretty radical call not to replace him. Instead, they just scrapped that role entirely. There is no sporting director at Manchester United anymore. And the responsibility was spread across a few different people, namely Omar Barada and, quite importantly, technical director Jason Wilcox. Another man that was given a little bit more responsibility was Christopher Vivell, who's playing a key strategic role in terms of recruitment behind the scenes as well. Dan Ashworth was basically separated out across 3 or 4 different people. And the thing is as well, INEOS framed this Dan Ashworth stint as a sort of failed experiment. It was power struggles, disagreements over recruitment, tension over the new manager, and Ratcliffe wanted sort of fewer voices in the club, faster decisions, a lighter, more efficient structure. And this is something that he is, again, so keen on across all of his businesses. He sort of goes into a place almost with a predetermined number of job cuts that he wants to make. He wants to slash things by 25% and kind of does it regardless of whether it's needed or not. And as supporters, this, again, just raises loads of questions. Who has the final say at Manchester United? Who's going to be accountable if the recruitment fails again, if the managerial recruitment fails again? A flatter structure can work, but only if the leadership is crystal clear. And right now, it does feel as though that clarity is still lacking. And let's move on to what has been arguably the biggest thing INEOS have done since they arrived. is this new stadium, this plan for a brand new Old Trafford, the home of Manchester United, will be moving. And this is one area where INEOS have been absolutely unequivocal. They want a new Old Trafford, 100,000 seats, centrepiece of a massive regeneration project around the Old Trafford area. And this wider plan is going to include 15,000 new homes, around 48,000 new jobs, and add supposedly £7 billion per year to the UK economy as a whole. And this is the thing, it's been positioned as this sort of best in the world stadium. And I'm sure it would be, but here's the issue. It's now been 10 months since we unveiled those plans. The original suggestion was that the work would begin before the end of 2025. That deadline's passed. In that time, all they've done is give Colette Roach the job of basically overseeing this stadium approach, and yet there has been no updates in almost a year now. They insist that they're being careful and not being slow. Colette Roach herself said, hopefully the stadium will be here for more than 100 years. We want to get that decision right. And that's fair enough, but time is ticking. Because again, it feeds into this narrative that there's a lot of talk at Manchester United, there's a lot of bluster, there's a lot of quick decision making, but actually, under the surface, is there a consideration? Is there reality? Is there a deeper, more nuanced version of what we see at surface level? Because at the moment it's keep Ten Hag and then sack him a few months later. Then it's get Amorim in and then sack him 12 months later. Then it's get an interim in and then we talk about how brilliant everything is and these tough decisions all made sense. But we're in a position that no Manchester United owner would ever willingly put the club in, which is we're ending another season with a manager that started halfway through. That's just a bad way to run things. And is the stadium being run on the same kind of ideas? Let's just get some sketches. Let's get a nice plastic model going so all the fans can get excited. And then actually 12 months later, no ground has been broken. We still don't even own the land that the stadium is meant to be being built on. And we're just sat here hoping that things are going to change. And then let's move on to what's happened this week. Ratcliffe, the politics, and all of the backlash. Speaking at a European industry summit, Ratcliffe claimed that the UK has been colonised by immigrants. The backlash was immediate across fans, across politics. United fans have called the comments disrespectful and divisive. Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the country, has spoken out and labelled the comments offensive and wrong. We've seen Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Manchester, someone that, let's be honest, you might want on board when you're trying to get this new stadium going. He called them inaccurate, insulting and inflammatory. Man United themselves released this weird statement that sort of highlighted their inclusivity and diversity. It was this incredibly thinly veiled response to Jim Ratcliffe's comments without naming him, without really addressing what he said, but just sort of trying to reiterate to all the people that may be offended by what he'd said that we care for you and this is a club that cares about these sorts of things. What a weird position that is to be for the club. What a strange position you're in where you have to basically make a statement disagreeing with your own owner, but you can't really reference him because he is the owner of the club, and you can't really disagree with what he said because, you might get sacked, let's be honest. Bizarre position for Manchester United to have to be in and the PR branch of Manchester United to have to be in. And this is the point. It's not just a personal or political perspective, but also, here's a point, Andy Burnham is going to be central to the stadium project. Ratcliffe later apologised for his language, saying that he wanted to raise the issue of controlled immigration, economic growth and not inflame division, but the damage has been done. We're still talking about this multiple days later, and it's not just about politics, it's about relationships. What about the players on the pitch that are immigrants themselves or from the family of immigrants? What about the fans that come into the stadium week in, week out from all different walks of life? And for a project as complex as building a new Old Trafford, public trust and political goodwill are essential. This doesn't make sense to speak out like this. And I think INEOS basically now face this uncomfortable reality. You can't rebuild Manchester United in isolation from Manchester itself. The Manchester United fans are a huge part of what Manchester United is. Football clubs aren't businesses. And I think Jim Ratcliffe doesn't quite understand that. And this leads us on to some big questions that I think Manchester United and United fans can't really avoid. Do they get it? Fundamentally, does Jim Ratcliffe understand the magnitude of his position? Because we've had managers come in, Erik Ten Hag, Ruben Amorim, Louis van Gaal to a certain extent, and they get accused of not understanding the size of the job, the magnitude of Manchester United. But the same seems to be true of our minority owner. Does Jim Ratcliffe understand the power of his words? Because there's a big difference, like I said, between being the owner of a petrochemicals company and owning Manchester United. The general public, en masse, don't care what the owner of INEOS says, but they do care what the owner of Manchester United says. Football clubs aren't just businesses, they're livelihoods, they're the centres of friendships, they're the centres of families. Driving division and throwing United fans into this political debate, whether they want it or not, are not the actions of a smart and considered figurehead of a football club. Because whether you agree with what Jim Ratcliffe said or whether you disagree with what Jim Ratcliffe said, we all know that we've had some difficult conversations this week. Pretty much every single Man United fan, I'm sure, has had some difficult conversations this week. And is that what we want from the owner? He's not talking about football. He's not talking about which signing we should have and we can debate that in the pub or with our friends or with our family. He's talking about some of the biggest things in society. And obviously, as one of Britain's richest men, I'm sure internally he feels as though he has a right and maybe even a duty to talk about these biggest issues. Because let's be honest, he's probably leaning on the odd politician here or there. He needs government help as one of the biggest business owners in the country. But save it for those meetings. Save it for those behind closed doors chats where you're speaking to heads of other businesses, other billionaires. You have to know from a PR perspective that what you say matters. Every single Man United player, pretty much every footballer, gets PR training. What to say, what not to say, how not to bring the club into disrepute, how not to change the reputation of Manchester United on a global scale. And these are the sorts of comments that maybe in isolation will blow over, things will be okay. But if you don't understand that what you say matters more than just being the head of a business, Manchester United is massive and it means a lot to a lot of people all around the world. And if Jim Ratcliffe doesn't understand that, someone needs to teach him that. He should understand it. He's supposed to be a Manchester United fan. But I think just, again, whether you agree with the comments or not, the fact that he said them publicly, surely understanding the sort of furore that it would cause, to me, is very, very naive. The other question on the pitch is who ultimately defines United's football identity right now? Because it was supposed to be Dan Ashworth and Jason Wilcox. Dan Ashworth is no longer there. Jason Wilcox and Omar Barada, and presumably Jim Ratcliffe to a certain extent, will be tasked with finding Manchester United's new manager next season. And they have to get it right. You can't go 3 seasons, 3 sackings midway through the year. Manchester United must get the next appointment right, whether that's Michael Carrick, whether it's a new manager, someone else from outside. They have to get this one right, because at some point we're going to look back on 3-4 years ago before they were here and say, actually, Man United weren't in the place we wanted it to be, but we didn't finish 15th and we got Champions League football semi-regularly. You know, at some point you start looking on a wider scale and saying, actually, things haven't got any better. Now, I do think there has been some goodwill brought in by INEOS, and I do think the transfers on the pitch, as we've said so many times, have been very successful so far, and a massive improvement over the Woodward and John Murtaugh eras in charge of Manchester United's recruitment. But we need to start seeing that as results, and we need to start seeing a vision that plays out in the way they would expect it to. You can't bring Michael Carrick in as an interim manager, having sacked his predecessor halfway through the season, and then take credit for his success. That wasn't part of the plan. You've got lucky that Carrick is doing a better job than anyone thought he would. But don't act like we all knew we would eventually get here, that sacking Amorim was part of the plan, or sacking Ten Hag halfway through the season was part of the plan. And now we were destined to arrive at Michael Carrick, and he was destined to win 4 of his first 5 games. That's nonsense. At some point we need to see your actions have obvious consequences that are successful. Not 15th, hopefully 4th, 5th, 3rd this season, having failed along the way in terms of keeping your guy in charge. We need to see some consistency from the leadership at Manchester United. INEOS didn't underestimate Manchester United financially, but they may have underestimated the scale of the pressure and scrutiny that comes with owning part of this club. They've made some structural changes, they've made difficult decisions, and they've set out what they see as a long-term plan. But at Manchester United, performance and leadership go hand in hand. Results matter, of course, but so does how you carry the club. So does how you communicate. So does how you understand Manchester United and its place in world football and world society. And right now, both of those things are massively under the microscope.